All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome back. So, this morning we've had a number of questions. You're seeing a lot of information circulate around the internet with questions that relate pretty much to law and what kind of legal system that we're going to have, whether it's going to be natural law, whether it's moral, whether it's legal rights, and who best to have that conversation with. And my friend, Bruce Pardy. Hi, Bruce.
Hello, Nadine. How are you?
How is Florida?
It's cold. Now,
Really?
yeah, I don't mean cold, cold. I mean, there's not going to be any sympathy coming my way, but it's colder than usual. People are clinging to their jackets and their hats, even down here. So there you go.
Wow, wow, it's beautiful here. I mean, it's not Florida weather, but it's pretty nice. You left at the wrong time.
Well, I was there at the right time, though. When we were traveling around Alberta doing our traveling road show, it was gorgeous. At times, it was 10, even 15 degrees. So I understand that after I left, things changed. So there you go.
Well, not really. Things
No,
did change, but my life went back to somewhat normal and
I'm sorry, I was speaking about the weather, but sure.
oh, yes, the weather, of course. Oh my goodness. This is what happens when you spend a week in a car together. Um, Bruce, let's sum up a little bit of that tour that we did, though, real quick here before we jump into some other stuff. We had
Sure.
lots of people that really had some good questions. And what was your sentiment, your takeaways from that tour that we did here in Alberta?
Well, my impression was that there are a lot of people in Alberta who are determined to do this. They've been waiting long enough. Their patience is now spent. They're ready to go. And there was a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of questions, and that's great. Questions are good. Some of the questions were both sensible, but also, I think, reflected an expectation that perhaps cannot be met. And by that, I mean, people want to know, okay, so what's going to happen? What's going to happen with this or with that? What's going to happen to my ability to do these things? What about these services? What is the plan? And the only person who can tell you if there is a plan and what the plan is Danielle Smith. Because nobody else who's involved in this and is advocating for independence, we all have ideas about what the future Alberta ought to look like. But the only person who has control of that, or will have control of it after a successful referendum, is Danielle Smith and her government, because they are the ones who will have the political power to conduct negotiations and to be, presumably, unless something changes, and it may, but at the present time, they will be the ones who have the political power to shape the first steps in forming a new country. So all of this conversation is important and relevant, but there is nobody else who can answer the question, what is the plan? Because nobody else is in a position to make a plan.
Yeah, I guess the best we can do is discuss ideas. And, that's much what we've been trying to do on this show and much of our conversations is, well, we could do this, we could do this, it could look like that. But I mean, I think that's a decision that Albertans have to shape, as opposed to one or two voices, which we hear so strongly come out so definitively about how things will be. I think is somewhat misleading and not necessarily honest, nor is it, I think, necessarily what Albertans want. I think Albertans want to be a part of the conversation. And at least our tour that we did, that was the one takeaway that I found was people want to be a part of the conversation. Yeah, they want to know kind of what things can look like. But there seems to be almost really two camps. One, that really is just like, hey, let's get rid of the Ottawa and kind of leave things as they are. And then there is, I think, a lot of people who attended our meetings who truly do seem to want a new Alberta, one where there is freedom, one where there is significant changes made to the legal system, to governance, and to, different services that could or could not be provided.
Correct. And one of the strategies, I think, that the first group is following, that group who wants things to remain pretty much as they are or something similar without Ottawa. In other words, let's get rid of Ottawa and otherwise just more or less carry on. We'll make some tweaks, but things should remain mostly the same. One of the strategies there is to be making assertions about what must remain because of the law. For example, people are suggesting that Alberta, a new independent Alberta, will be obliged to honor Aboriginal treaties. That is not true. I'll tell you why it's not true. It's not true because independence is a repudiation of the existing constitutional order. Now, let's just consider for a moment the arguments that are made that the law requires you to honor treaties and to have, two-tier rights and special status and so on. In other words, you have to continue the system of Aboriginal rights that exists now in Canada. Why is that? Well, because, they say, because it's part of the Constitution. It's in Section 35. Because the treaties are contracts made between peoples, and so on. These things are all embedded in the Constitution, and that is true. That is true. If Alberta continued on as a province of Canada, all of those things would be true. But the point is that independence is a repudiation of that constitutional order. In other words, in order to find out what the new Alberta is going to do and what it's going to be, you do not look to the existing Constitution of Canada. That's the thing you are leaving. Let me put this in the words of the Supreme Court itself. This is the 1998 reference case. Supreme Court says, with respect to the negotiations that would happen following a successful referendum vote, here's what the Supreme Court says. It says, in those negotiations, there would be no conclusions predetermined by law on any issue. Let me say that again. This is the Supreme Court, 1998 reference case. There would be no conclusions predetermined by law on any issue. That means you're starting again. And that means that all of these questions would be up for discussion at the negotiations. Now, there are lots of choices. Of course, the new Alberta could decide, for example, to continue the existing system of Aboriginal rights as exists in Canada. That's a choice. But the point is, it is a choice. Open to it.
I think that's what's really important for people to understand is that it is a choice. We are truly abandoning all of the Constitution, and all of the Constitution, all of it needs to be renegotiated as to what a new Alberta would look like. And the opportunity is there, which is both good and bad, because really what's going to be the deciding factor is who sits across the other side of that table to have that negotiation, which I think that's a conversation that's worth having with Albertans, because, if that is a Danielle Smith, she can go in, negotiate better terms, not necessarily negotiate independence. And or, doesn't matter what she negotiates. The point is that she's the one in the driver's seat to negotiate the terms themselves.
That's correct. That's correct. Yes. And let's just acknowledge now another an aspect of the law that the UCP has put into place that may tie her hands, but not because of the Canadian Constitution and not because of the federal government. and not because of the Clarity Act. We talked about this before, Nadine, but the UCP has put an amendment into the Alberta Referendum Act, which suggests that no referendum result can result in a derogation of Aboriginal rights as guaranteed under Section 35 of the Constitution. In other words, it may be that choice has been made already, but it is still a choice, and it's still a choice that can be changed right now because, of course, the referendum hasn't been held yet. But the point still remains: these are choices that Alberta itself can make, and the Alberta government seems to have indicated what its choice might be even before the people have expressed what their choice might be.
Yeah, and I think that's the important part here, again, to highlight is that, it's a lot of people. So you get a lot of people right now who it's very funny how there's such a double standard from east to west. Quebec went through all of this separation movement. Never once did I hear somebody say they were traitors. This is treason. And now you have, premiers, EB talking about how Alberta separation and separatists are traitors and this is treason. And, you know, to me, I look at such an opportunity as this, to truly wipe the slate clean and remake something, noting the best that the world has to offer today, to
Yes,
correct
yes,
some of the wrongs that have been
yes,
done, to kind of
yes.
and strengthen, fortify some of the things that have been done right. And yet, for doing that, you have other premiers, this is the problem I have with politics because they have the ear of the press. And people are hearing these things, and of course, unfortunately, believing much of what they are hearing without fully understanding where the problems lie. And Daniel Smith and the UCP government in that referendum act, they are part of the problem here because they have almost predetermined an outcome as it relates to Indigenous people, and that it cannot violate Section 35. So,
Right, right. And so let's emphasize the point again. In this process, the law as it exists in Canada does not predetermine any question on any issue. And therefore, those people who are making the argument that Alberta is obligated under the law to do certain things in its new state as a new country, that is not true. Now, people might think, well, how can that be? The court says this, court says that. Isn't this a court supervised process? Once the referendum is approved, the two sides enter into negotiations, and aren't there some predetermined things there? What if one side doesn't behave properly or give the proper concessions and so on? The answer is this, and this is also an answer the Supreme Court has given in this case, 1998. The Supreme Court goes out of its way to say these negotiations are political. They are not legal. In other words, this is going to be a political give and take in a set of political negotiations. And to the extent that they are political, the court says, the courts will have no supervisory role. In other words, this is not a situation where the courts are going to impose certain conclusions on these negotiations. In other words, you are on your own. And that means that Alberta, negotiating with the federal government and the rest of Canada, can decide for itself what kind of a country it wants to be and negotiate for that end with the federal government and the rest of them. So Alberta's future is dependent only upon Alberta's imagination and creativity, and then to the process of negotiating with the rest of the country.
And so this is where, for me, I really want to kind of put this to bed because I'm finding it's getting a little old. Like I'm listening to Keith Wilson, I'm listening to Jeff Rath, I'm listening to these other people, again, these very loud voices that are dictating already. They've made predeterminations that, oh, we're going to honor treaties. Oh, we're going to respect, the Constitution as it exists. And I'm like, that's a problem for me. And you and I have talked about this many times where what's the point of going through this exercise? What's the point of having this fight only to leave all of Canada intact within a new Alberta? It makes no sense. And so if we're
Yes,
not
right.
even willing to acknowledge right from the get-go that these are choices that we can choose to make, but do not have to make, then, for me, I look at this and I go, why bother to be at all?
I tend to agree. I tend to agree. The whole point of this is to not only get out of Canada, to get rid of Ottawa. I mean, that, of course, that's very important. But it is also to make a fresh start. Alberta right now, as a province of Canada, has become infused with the features of Canadian government. And even if you get rid of Ottawa, you still have those features in there. And those are the kinds of things you need to purge in order to get your fresh start. Now, I just want to refer, before we finish on this topic, refer you to one further sentence in this Supreme Court of Canada decision, because, as we've all seen, these claims include claims that the Supreme Court has said that a province that is leaving is obliged to provide for the rights and interests of certain groups of people, minorities and Aboriginal people. Okay. Here is the sentence that the Supreme Court says. They say negotiations would need to address the interests of the other provinces, the federal government, and indeed the rights of all Canadians, both within and outside Quebec. Remember, this decision is about Quebec, but it would apply to Alberta as well. Canadians both within and outside Alberta, and specifically the rights of minorities. Now, let's back up. The beginning of that sentence goes like this: negotiations would need to address. What does address mean? Here's what it does not mean. Addressing does not mean guaranteeing. It does not mean continuing. It does not mean the status quo. Negotiations address something when they are discussed. Negotiations would need to discuss the interests of the other provinces, the federal government, and the rights of minorities. That is
Yeah.
all. That is the only requirement, that you turn your mind to it and you discuss it. And if it is the intent of Alberta to say we want a country that is based upon different premises and principles than Canada, and that includes the principle that the same rights and freedoms will apply to everyone without regard to who you are, then that is addressing the question that the Supreme Court is suggesting needs to be addressed.
So really, we just need to come with a framework as to it will be one rule of law that applies to everybody. And if this is the framework from which we are starting our negotiations and our conversation, that is indeed addressing how we are going to, deal with the other provinces and or minority groups, et cetera. So there is
Correct.
no prescribed um, format
There are no
or
there
starting position for this conversation.
there will be no conclusions predetermined by law on any issue. The Supreme Court's own words. One of the biggest risks, biggest dangers, biggest liabilities in this process will be that Alberta will forget that it is trying not to be Canadian and will default to the Canadian way of doing things, the Canadian way of thinking about things, the Canadian framework in its constitution for the way things are supposed to be. The whole point for Alberta is to get away from that framework. If you don't do that, as you alluded to a few minutes ago, why bother?
Yeah, and one of the things I find very fascinating right now is I do not understand why we have people who have, for some reason, latched on to this whole idea, especially around the Aboriginal communities and Indigenous rights, because 42,000 people, I do believe, is what Leighton Gray at the Fundamental Truths had pointed out. 42,000 people live on reserves, and that is collective rights. They don't own that land even. And there's so much more opportunity here for them, to even get out from underneath this broken system to where they have equal opportunity and truly equal rights, because I believe the Indian Act has been nothing but suppressive
Mhm.
to them, and we do have this entire Aboriginal industry that has been built up around them, to which they themselves are being, in my opinion, used as pawns in a game, as opposed to benefactors of the system. So I look at this and I go, I do not understand for the life of me why this conversation keeps coming up again and again and again. 42,000 people. And I mean, and if you want to talk about chiefs and the industry itself, it is so small, not in dollars, but in the number of people who benefit from this. And yet we keep entertaining this. Oh, no, don't worry. We're going to keep. Why are we doing this? Like, we have 5 million people that live in this province, 42,000 live on a reserve. They get one vote like everybody else. You don't want to separate? Cast your ballot. But you have chiefs that are coming out and telling elected governments to step aside, and yet they don't even see the hypocrisy of it themselves, them dictating to everybody else.
Right, right. Well, so as Leighton describes and describes very well, this is a system of segregation. Now, people don't like to think of it that way because, in their minds, segregation is a thing that happens in other countries, other places, who are bad. But this is a system of segregation. He's absolutely right. And the irony is that this system of segregation works to the benefit of neither group, not the ones who are segregated and not the ones who are not. The people that benefit from this system of segregation are the people who are in charge of the segregation, both the people who run the reserves, the people who belong, and are at the head of the bands, and also the people who work in the government who are maintaining the system. Right? This is the Aboriginal industry that you referred to. It works to their advantage and only their advantage. And those are the people who want it to continue. That's not surprising. So it is important that everybody else who is not a member of those groups, and by say groups, I mean the elites, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, that everybody else needs to say this system clearly does not work. It does not work to the benefit of anyone, including those it pretends to benefit. It's time to end this system of institutional dependency. This is exactly what Leighton says, and I totally agree with him. It's time to move on. And in order to move on, Alberta has to leave and insist that it is going to take the moment to establish a new way of governing that does not resemble the Canadian Constitution.
All right. Now that's a great segue into what would this new system look like? Because you and I, and we're not the only ones, have had many different discussions about legal versus moral rights
Yes.
and what a new Alberta should look like. Because we both agree, I think 100%, that a new system would limit the power of government. And that has been the challenge throughout history. I think the United States got that right in the beginning, but we've even seen today how that's been used and abused. So how do you establish a framework where it is truly a free nation, where people are free to decide for themselves the choices that they make, but the government stays out of their way and out of their lives, whether that's, corporately, through the business that they run? Because right now you have a government that lays claim to everything. They own everything, they control everything. And you are the one that have to ask permission. And what we're, to your point, you've said this many times, flip the script. Give the government zero power except for what the people give it. And so,
Yes.
how do we establish that in practical terms, Bruce?
Right. Okay. So the first thing that we need to do, I think, is acknowledge the reality that in the system that we have, the government, the crown, oversees all of it, and it does in fact have the authority to do with you as it wishes. Now, sure, we have the charter, have some rights thrown in there, and they look great, they sound great, but they're actually not what people think that they are. The authority lies with the crown and the government and parliament and so on.
Okay, now before we go too far on that, because this comes up oftentimes, you have people who keep pretending that we will be a commonwealth. Now, that
Right.
word in particular has meaning, right? Especially in
Yep.
law. And they're like, no, 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 we can be a republic, but still be a commonwealth. Now, I'm looking at this and I want to, today is about cleaning up some of the language and clearing up some of the questions. And you just pointed out that Canada still has, the crown still has authority here. And so many people in Canada believe today that, oh, no, 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 no. They're just figurative. It's not, they have no legitimate authority. So let's tackle that one right from the
All right.
start.
Sure. So the king, Charles, is a figurehead, but the crown rules. And the crown is essentially has become the political actors who have power. The prime minister, the cabinet, the privy council who are not elected, the institutions of government at the core have control the crown, or essentially are the crown, or reflect the crown, and the crown has power, not the king, but the crown. And this all gets a little bit murky, right? Because this is not all set out in text in the Constitution. A lot of it is implied. A lot of it's borrowed. The structure borrowed from the United Kingdom. A lot of it is in the so-called unwritten Constitution. But the source of authority for the state is broad. That's the default position. The state can do anything. And then we carve out exceptions, or pretend to. And those exceptions include your charter rights. So that's the situation that we have. And if you want to change that, you have to change the architecture. And by that I mean you have to start with, in my opinion, as you said, you have to start by changing the default. And the default is the state is all powerful. The crown is all powerful. The default is the state is powerless. The state can do nothing except the things that you want it to do. And there are some things you don't want, not to have a state at all. Let's just imagine this for a moment. Let's say you're determined to have a free society, which is great. I mean, that's what we want. But you say, well, the state is the threat to a free society, and there's truth to that. On the other hand, if you have no state at all, then what do you have? Well, you now have a state of anarchy. And let's just go back a step and say, all right, when you said you wanted a free society, what do you mean? And for my money, being free means that each one of us is not subject to the coercion of other people. In other words, No one can attack you. No one can make you do things you don't want to do with the threat of violence. People can't take your stuff. They can't break into your house. In other words, we do have limits on what people can do. And those limits are you can't attack other people. In order for that to be a rule, a law, you need to have a state
Mhm.
because that's what states are. That's what states do. That's the monopoly on violence. There is no law. Let's put it this way. There is no law without violence or the threat of violence. It is the use of force that distinguishes a law from a sentiment. We can go around saying, well, people shouldn't do that. People should leave each other alone. People shouldn't take each other's stuff. You know, people should be peaceful. Should. Those are sentiments. You become a law. It becomes a law when you say, thou shalt not. And if you do, you will be punished. That makes a law. And you can't punish people or prevent them from doing those things or make them liable unless you have the force of the state to back you up. That's why you need a state. But you
Now,
have to limit the state to that job, right?
yes, and therein becomes a challenge. How do you limit the state to the powers that you want it to have, but without now overstepping, overreaching? Because as we've seen here in Canada, that does not happen. Even though we have even constitutions that clearly identify jurisdiction between provinces and federal, that they can't even seem to respect that. So here becomes the challenge is how do we limit the state power? Because everything in my understanding of law, it comes down
Mhm,
to authority, comes down
mhm,
to jurisdiction, and then obligation.
mhm.
So who establishes the authority? Who's going to be the ultimate authority?
Right. So the Constitution of your country is the supreme law of the country. We have that in Canada right now. But one of the difficulties with that Constitution, as with the others, including the American one, which is the gold standard. But even as you alluded to earlier, even in the American situation, the institutions down there have found the gaps in the American Constitution, and now the degree of liberty it provides is not as good as it ought to be. So it's not just a case of repeating the U.S. Constitution because that is shown to not so work so well either. So in our Constitution, which is the supreme law, you have jurisdictions set out, you have jobs set out, and yet the authorities have overrun the place. And here's one Achilles heel of every written constitution. They are written in words, and they have to be, right? How else are you going to do it? You have to write it down. But when you write it down, then another institution gets the power to interpret what the words mean. And words are inherently ambiguous. It is not possible to definitively write down exactly what you mean in a way that applies to all circumstances. And so those passages must be interpreted and given meaning by courts, which means that you're now subject to the rule of courts and not of constitutions. Okay. So, how do you limit the power of the courts? And for that matter, how do you limit the power of the people who are assigned powerful roles inside the Constitution? All right. So the first thing is to flip this default to make it explicit that the powers of the state are limited, are well, non-existent except for the exceptions you set out. And then how do you guarantee that the people in power will honor the words, that text, that default flip? Right. Well, the one of the other aspects of this is to make sure that you do not entrench a powerful ruling class. So in the Constitution itself, you provide for a very limited duration for anybody to work in any capacity with state power. Politicians, bureaucrats, judges, employees of any kind, consultants, ambassadors, officers, anybody who works for the state will work and you know you can pick any random period of time, but it has to be a concrete period of time so that you are establishing a very short timeline, revolving door inside the government. You go in, you work for, 6, 8 years, whatever the number you choose is, and then you get out. And after that time, if you are a politician for 8 years, you have no state role after that at all. Your time is done. If you are a judge for 8 years, and by the way, I think judges should be elected, but we can discuss that separately. Once you're a judge for 8 years, you're done. You are done serving the state in any capacity. You can't be a politician and then be a judge. You can't be a judge and then be an ambassador. You can't be a politician and then a bureaucrat or vice versa. If you are a receptionist for a government office for 8 years, you're done. You can't run for anything. You can't be a judge. You can't be a consultant. You can't be a supplier. You're done. So what do we get? We get, I like to call it, an amateur government. That is a lack of a political class. There is nobody with entrenched interests in the state. There is nobody with an interest in building up the power of the state because they're not going to be around. Why do it in your own interests to try and build a little empire inside the state if you're on your way out the door?
Well, in
There's no reason to
reality,
do.
there would be very little for the state to do, to be
But
honest, because the
but
private
this is
sector, the individuals, the people, the citizens themselves be the ones doing. The government is there to do only those small handful of, functions that, for convenience sake, not for, and again, I mean, I mentioned this in one of my presentations, Frederick Bastiat, who,
yes,
talked about
yes,
legalized plunder. When
yes.
people begin to realize that they can lobby the government for special interest, then that's exactly what they will do. If the government does not have that ability to grant that wish, or that they don't have the power, then you won't have anybody lobbying it for the special interest, right? So, if it's a good idea, take it, run with it, go do it. But you'll do it as a
Well, this is
private citizen, not
right.
because, the government has somehow granted you favor.
And so this is where all these elements come together, right? If you look at any one of these elements alone, you'd think, well, that's great, except that, well, will that be enough on its own? And the answer is, well, but don't look at it on its own. It's a combination of these things. So let's just put these two elements together. These are not the only two elements, but let's deal with these two. The first one is the state is powerless except for these limited number of things. And these limited number of things I've been describing as keep the peace, resolve disputes, that is, have courts, and defend the country, like have a military and borders, but not very much else. And these are the exceptions to the no power rule. Okay. You take that and combine it with limited tenure. Let's call it 8 years. Okay. You have a government that can't do very much except for those three things. And you have nobody embedded inside the government anyway. No powerful people inside the government. Okay. Well, the combination of those two things means there's no point in lobbying anybody because nobody owes you anything and they can't do anything anyway. I mean, this kind of government would be making not very much policy about many things. You're not going to be able to create monopolies. You're not be able to give favors. You're not going to be able to pay subsidies. Like, what's the point? You have a relatively powerless government run by relatively powerless people. And it will be doing the jobs that the state is actually required to do. Keep the peace, resolve disputes, protect the country. If they're able to do those three things, but nothing else, now you've got the beginning of an actually free country, a genuinely free country in which, aside from those things, people are self-sufficient and make their own way in their own lives. And there are other elements of this too. You're building a constitutional architecture to create the thing that you say that you want, which is unlike the thing that we have now.
Well, today we have nothing but unions everywhere, whether they're public or whether they're teachers or nurses, or, and these are all, again, institutions that, get favor from having big governments. And, this is where our biggest, in my opinion, biggest resistance is going to come from. And yet, you know, every individual, who is a citizen of Alberta stands to gain, by getting rid of these kinds of institutions and these powers. To have a truly free society means that you are free to explore to the depths of your person, your being, your talent, and again, as long as you don't harm another person. So, I look at just such amazing opportunity, and yet you get such resistance from some people, and it makes you wonder, like, why? Because other people have just, I think in Canada, and this is part of the get the Canada out of Alberta, is they are used to being taken care of. They want to be taken care of. They do not want to accept the responsibility that comes with freedom.
Sure. And if you look at some of the people who are insisting that you more or less keep the status quo without Ottawa, many of them, as to be expected, many of them are people who have um, interests in keeping the status quo. I mean, if you are a government employee, for example, this new Alberta threatens to eliminate your job. You're going to have to find something else to do in the private sector, the way it's supposed to be, in my opinion. If you are, a leader of a union, this is a death knell for the source of your wealth. It doesn't work for you. So amongst those people who object vociferously to this kind of a change, just look and see what their interests are, and see if it makes sense that they would be opposed to this kind of a change. So let's talk about another group. I'm a professor at a university in Ontario. I have long said that I think that universities should be private institutions, without two things: without government subsidies and without government accreditation. In other words, I think education should be a private sector function, like most other things. But if you had this kind of Alberta that I'm describing, you would not have public universities that are subsidized by governments, and therefore all the people who right now are ensconced in that environment will be opposed to this. Maybe not all of them, but many of them will be, because their situation is threatened. But in order for this to work, there can't be any sacred cows. If there is one sacred cow, there will be lots of them. And once you have lots of them, that means you're not on a different track now. You're on the same track. You're basically on the same track, fiddling in the margins about, how can we, reduce the size of government and reduce the budget. That is not a solution to anything. We've gone down that road over and over and over again. It never works. You have to change the nature of government. In order to do that, you need to change the nature of the Constitution.
So let's talk about that for a second, because we've talked about, the people who work in government, the fact that they would lose their positions in government. But what people fail to also realize is that creates a space in the private sector for an individual. Right. So,
Of course.
because everything the government is doing, if it truly, truly is something that needs to be done, the private sector will do it. Now, this is the problem I have with government, because government is very wasteful and inefficient. It often takes three people to do what one person can accomplish in the private sector. But that doesn't mean that other opportunities are not going to arise, because I think this is where a lot of people come at this from a perspective of fear. "Oh, I'm going to lose my job." But what they don't stop to look at is that you're also not going to pay taxes, right? Or potentially far less taxes. So when people go, "Well, I won't have the money to, healthcare is expensive, and or public education's expensive." Yeah, but you're also going to have more money in your pocket to do that, and you're also going to have a system that balances itself out, because I can't charge more than what people can afford unless government gets involved. Once the
Right.
government gets involved, then, because of subsidies and grants, and then you have a system that creates on affordability, right? Because, and this is the big topic today is, oh, I can't afford this. I can't afford that. People can't afford to have kids. They can't afford to buy a house. They can't afford, can't afford, can't afford. Why? And what does the government do? Instead of address the problem, oh, well, we'll give you a rebate. Well, that rebate is coming out of the productive part of society's pockets and it's being redistributed. Redistribution does not solve the problems. It just prolongs them. It kicks them further down the road. So, these are the conversations that I want people to start to understand because, everybody is talking to the echo chamber, right? But
Yeah,
we
sure,
somehow have
sure.
to reach the people who think that their jobs, their lives are at risk here. When I'm looking at this going, you too are a citizen, life becomes more affordable for you. Opportunities open up when governments get out of the way.
The main drag on people's wealth is the government.
Yes.
If you had the government out of the way, you'd be much better off than you are right now. And both directly and indirectly, right? I mean, there's taxes, of course. There's taxes on this and taxes on that and taxes on the tax on the tax. So there's that. But there's also its effect upon the productivity of the society in general, right? You've got allocation problems, you've got efficiency problems, you've got waste problems, you've got grift problems. Everybody being on the take you've got um, monetary policy and Bank of Canada and producing inflation and minimizing or extracting essentially the value of the wealth that you have. These are all, and there's lots of more. These are all ways in which governments impoverish us. And the first thing to do to not be impoverished is to get rid of the state role in so many things. Here's an equation that I think occurs in some people's heads. They hear something like, and I've advocated for this. I've advocated for Alberta ending the system of single payer public healthcare. And I think some people have this equation in their heads. They hear the end of single payer public healthcare. And what they think is, oh my God, it's the end of healthcare. Those two things are not the same thing. It's actually the opposite. If you end single payer public healthcare, what you are likely to get is access to healthcare, which is what you don't have right now. Not in a good way, not in a timely way, not in a guaranteed way.
Not at
Right
all.
now,
We have a sick care
right?
system, which is one
Right.
way, my way or no way. We saw that during COVID. You didn't get a choice as to what medicine or conversation even you could have with your own doctor as to
Right.
the best uh, service and or products that met your requirements and needs and desires. So I mean, we're seeing this with healthcare, and I think again, Sean Buckley talked about this
Yes.
tremendous detail, which I hope to have Sean on here very quickly, about Health Canada, and it
Yes.
is a monopoly, right? You are being
Yes. Yes.
told and restricted and limited as to what your choices are. And most of them have to do with you being sick, not with
Right.
you trying to pursue health.
Right. But you see, this is not an accident. Anybody could have predicted this. Because look, so we all know about the stories from the Soviet Union about people, lining up for miles and miles when some store gets shoes to sell. Because because the shelves were often bare, and then a store suddenly got shoes to sell, and everybody lined up for shoes because they couldn't get shoes. And why is that? Well, because the government controlled everything, and so there was no supply and demand. There was no private entrepreneurs making shoes. They just weren't allowed to do that.
Well, there was no
And the inevitable is
motivation
there was
to
no
do
reason. There was
that.
no reason, no incentive, no reason to do that. And in fact, the government authorities might have prevented you anyway. Right.
Exactly.
So you have an inevitable shortage of shoes. So let's just play that out. Let's say it's not shoes. Imagine that, in Alberta, instead of shoes, let's say food. Let's say the government controls and runs the system of food production and sale. In other words, you're not allowed to make it yourself, and you're not allowed to buy it from anybody that not supervised and paid for by the government. It's a single payer food distribution system. Only the government can pay for food and will pay the same amount for every person. Okay? What you're going to get is a food shortage.
What you're going to get is Cuba.
You're going to get Cuba. Now, if that's the case for shoes and it's the case for food, why isn't it the case for healthcare? And the answer is it is the case for healthcare. That's exactly why you can't get timely care. It's because the government runs and pays for the system.
Well, even the doctors inside the system have limited ability to influence the system. Like I have friends who are doctors who have, great ideas as to how to increase efficiency, how to get rid of waste, how to provide better client care, and all of it gets rejected because the
Of course.
system is there to protect itself.
That's correct. It is there to protect itself and the people within it. To break it down is not a thing that's possible. And that is the reason why this moment of independence is so crucial. If you do not get it right from the get-go, is the opportunity is lost because you will establish new vested interests. And you'll then be in the same kind of situation that you're in right now inside Canada. Reform has proven to be virtually impossible. Yeah, the reform around the edges, change rules here or there, but to do away with the system and start again, that is the thing that lies before you if you're successful in this referendum. To lay bare the table and start again, and to do it right, and make sure you do it right, because what you do is going to be with you essentially forever.
Now, again, because for me, it's wonderful to talk to the echo chamber. It's wonderful to see all these people to come out and sign a petition for, in support of, an independent Alberta. But, we have so many people that just are not even willing to engage in the conversation. And it really boils down to, in my opinion, they're just coming from a place of fear, a lack of understanding of what opportunities truly do exist. And, when I look at this, so many people are so caught up with their socialist, welfare programs, and the government, but I want to go back to when the days when, people moved here, they were pioneers, they were entrepreneurs. The government wasn't there to tell them what to do, when to do, how to do. And guess what? We were extremely successful, right?
Mhm.
And then the systems creep in and, the socialist aspect creeps in. Um, and I want to talk to those individuals. Like, how do we work with those individuals to understand the opportunity and stop living from this place of fear of what they have to lose and look at what they have to gain? Because I mean, fear is a far bigger stick than, dangling a carrot. Right. I mean, everybody's afraid of losing something as opposed to, I see this with the pension plan. I see this with, other conversations and healthcare and education, and you get these unions who, like I said, have a very vested interest in
Mhm.
preserving the system because it serves their needs. But I want to challenge the nurses. I want to challenge the teachers themselves. Is the system really so great? Because every time I turn around, I hear them complaining about too many kids, too much this, not enough this. And yet I'm sitting here and I look at even the number, just pure number. If you look at the number of doctors, 12,000, almost 13,000 doctors in this province, a province of 5 million people. Break it down. Just do the math. So we have, 5 million people, let's say 13,000 doctors is just under, but if we were to take just straight math and look at the number of people, that means every doctor working 220 days a year, you get all your vacations, all your statutory holidays, everything else, just 220 days like everybody else. That means you have to see 3 people a day. Does that sound like you're overworked to me? This is not even about money, right? For me, this is about just common sense. Let's do some math here. And people go, oh, well, not every doctor. We used to have generalists. who looked at you as a whole person, right? Now everybody's a specialist, right? And they go, well,
Well,
that therein lies a problem, because the government has fed this system of subsidies and specialized medicine everywhere you go, but yet nobody looks at the whole anymore, right? And this is a lack of feedback, I think, in my opinion, from the market, right? Supply and demand,
right,
right?
right,
I
right. Yeah. Yes, let's contrast market dynamics with something else that's very popular, which is democracy, because those two things are very, very different.
Mhm.
In fact, you might also say that, the idea of freedom is very different from the idea of democracy. People like democracy because it gives power to the people, right? As
Democracy
opposed
is
to
51% rules the other 49. It's mob rules. It is not freedom.
that's my point. The democracy is a very dangerous thing. And yeah, you want democratic rule rather than um, dictatorship or monarchy or elitism. Yes, but you don't want full-fledged democratic rule, because that means the mob can tell everybody what to do. You don't want that. You still need a supreme law that sets out what the boundaries for your democratic processes are going to be. Right. So the example I like to use is people suggest, look, it's got to be a republic, and I agree with that. But we want to rule by democratic means in the extreme sense. We're going to put everything to a plebiscite, like no legislation, the law without giving the question to the people. Okay, but let's say there's something on the table that says, well, do the people agree that that guy over there should give up his house because it's in the general welfare? And if they all vote yes, then you lose your house. Okay. That means you don't have any rights. That means you don't actually have your liberty. That means your liberty is subject to the inclinations of the mob. That's a terrible idea. That means you don't have a free society, right? So democracy is not a panacea. There's a role for it. You want elections for your politicians and hopefully your judges, but that's the extent of it. You don't want the opinions of your neighbors to determine what it is that you are allowed and not allowed to do.
And therein lies